were settling Jerusalem. And of all the Jewish people, the active propagation, or the active advertisement to come and settle Jerusalem was specific to the Karaites movement. Other movements, all Jewish movements, turned and prayed toward Jerusalem. So you know in your synagogue you face east, so we're all facing Jerusalem. But the actively settling Jerusalem was a Karaite trait. And this gentleman down here, Daniel al-Kumisi, he was a 10th century Karaite, so over 1,000 years ago. And he's telling people to rise and come to Jerusalem. And then he has this, words, if you're not going to come, then at least send 5 men or families together with enough to support themselves so they can come and repopulate Jerusalem. And his plan was working, and it was working, and it was working. And then the community got wiped out in the Crusades. Does anybody know what the Crusades is? You guys have heard of the Crusades. So it was basically a war where that ravaged the Middle East and the entire Mediterranean area is basically where the Christians were trying to reclaim Jerusalem. And so the Karaite community was actually damaged in the Crusades, and it really never recovered after the Crusades. Okay, so this is the Karaite Jewish synagogue in Jerusalem. This is here a menorah, and on the right side is just, again, the same menorah that's lit up, and this is the ark where the Torah would be. And we'll talk a little bit more about Karaite synagogues, but the thing I want to show you, because the Karaites were the most active in resettling Jerusalem, the synagogue of the Karaite sect is older than all the synagogues in the Jewish quarter. So if you go to Jerusalem and you have a chance to see the Karaite synagogue, know that that's the oldest synagogue there. It's been standing there and been established there before any of the other synagogues in the area. Okay, how do Karaites pray? I mentioned earlier that Karaites pray with something called full prostration. This is actually my father right here, leading a Karaite prayer in 1984 in Foster City, California. And you could see he's praying on his knees. Does anyone, what does this look like to you? Yeah, say it. No, anyone? Yeah. It looks like how Muslims pray in mosques. That's exactly right. What's interesting, though, is that all Jews historically used to pray like this. In the Talmud, it talks about praying like this. In the Mishnah Torah, it talks about praying like this. Now, the Karaites and the Rabbinites have a slightly different way of prayer, but for the most part, they used to pray in this fashion. The Muslims actually borrowed this type of prayer from the Jews. So when you see the way the Muslims pray, you can think, or you should know, that this is actually the way that the Jews used to pray, and the Muslims borrowed it from the Jews. And what's also interesting is they most likely borrowed it from the Rabbinite Jews, not the Karaite Jews. And I can tell you how I know that, or how historians think that's the case. First, geographically, where the Muslims came from and where the Karaites and the Rabbinites were. But also, you see that the Karaites are praying on rugs. The praying on rugs was actually an old rabbinic tradition, so that the rabbis didn't bow down and pray on hard stone or cement. They had a prohibition against praying on stone or bowing down on stone. So they started praying with rugs. Well, when the Karaites started praying, they also took this tradition and started praying on rugs also. And that's also likely why the Muslims today pray on rugs as well. Okay, so I get a lot of questions about, oh yeah, question.
How did the difference of Karaites and Rabbinites start? Like, how did the difference come?
Okay, so that's a great question, and it's a sophisticated question, and I'm going to hope to answer it as simply as possible. From a Karaite perspective, we believe that the original form of Judaism was Karaite Judaism, and Rabbinic Judaism came later. In the Rabbinic tradition, they believe that the original form of Judaism was Rabbinite Judaism, and Karaite Judaism came later. So that's the philosophy. As a historical matter, the Karaites believe that there have always been Jews that followed only the Bible, so no Talmud, no oral law. And in about the 7th to 8th century, all these movements that were following Bible-only Judaism, they kind of started to merge together. And by the 10th century, there was a full movement of Jews who followed just the Bible and just the Karaite tradition, and there were also Jews who followed the Rabbinic tradition. So it's going to depend who you ask for the answer. Is that? Yeah. Any other questions? Great. Okay, so I always get questions about how the Karaite melodies are different from the Rabbinite melodies. And this gentleman here on the left, his name is Rotem Cohen. He was on the Israeli equivalent of American Idol, and it was called A Star is Born. You can't call something Israeli Idol in Israel because the word idol has a bad connotation to Jews. So he called it, so the show was called A Star is Born. And what's interesting is that one of the differences between the Karaites and the Rabbinites historically is that they differed on when the holidays fall. And this was a big, big difference between the Karaites and the Rabbinites, and we're not going to explain why they differed. But one of the differences was the date of Shavuot. In the Karaite tradition, we read the Bible, and we believe that Shavuot should always be on a Sunday. In the Rabbinic tradition, it always falls on a different day it could fall on a different day of the week. But for the Karaites, it's always on a Sunday. Well, he was on the show, A Star is Born, and he was supposed to sing live on a Saturday night. The problem is that Saturday night was the dates that the Karaites started observing Shavuot, right? So you know in the Jewish tradition, the date starts on the night before. The holiday started the night before. So he couldn't perform live on Shavuot. So what he did is he told his competition, look, the judges, I can't do this. The producers knew this. I can't do this. So they made him a solution. They said, why don't you record your singing, and we'll play the recording for our audience during instead of you during the show. So instead of you being live, you'll be on a recording. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was something that he accepted and worked. He actually didn't advance past that round, but he was actually very happy that they gave him the solution. And right here, this is actually we'll call it the entertainment section of one of the largest print newspapers in Israel. When he made this decision, they ran a full feature on him, and it says here Kohen Gadol, or the high priest, because he's a Kohen. Does anyone know what the high priest is? A few people, good. So the high priest is the one who served in the temple and had certain officiating duties in the temple, exactly. So they're making a play on this. They're calling him the high priest, or the big Kohen, because what he did was something big. And under it, it says that he passed up a chance at fame to observe the holidays of his community. And I think I mentioned to you earlier that, growing up, I'm sure for you, but also for me, being a minority is difficult, right? You have to take certain days off of school. You have to explain to your friends and teachers why you're doing things differently. But for him, he told me it wasn't even a choice. He said, this is what I do. This is what my community does. And I'm very, very excited to follow my tradition, even if it means a chance at passing up fame and fortune. Okay, so because he's a Kohen, there's something called I've asked him to record a song, and there's something called the priestly benediction. Have you guys heard the priestly benediction before? Yeah, quite a few. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So you've heard it in the synagogue, and it's where usually someone who's from the Kohen lineage will come before the synagogue and raise his hands and do a prayer. So I'm going to let he recorded the priestly benediction with the Karaite melody. And just think, I know you may not know exactly what the corresponding prayer is in your synagogue, but just think to yourself generally how it sounds and how it might be different from your tradition. All right, so some questions. Does that sound different to you from some melodies you might be familiar with? Oops, we will get that back up. Does that sound different to you for some melodies you might be familiar with? Yeah, it does. What does it sound like to you? It sounds more... Sounds more like the opera. Well, he will be thrilled to know that you think his voice sounds like the opera. And I'll make sure that the people from A Star is Born know they should give him another shot. That's great. What else does it sound like? Someone said it sounds more like from the Middle East. And that's right. So in the Jewish tradition, there are Jews from throughout the Middle East, not just Karaites. They're what's called Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews. And they have a tune and a tradition of singing that sounds very different from some of the tunes that you're familiar with, or you may be familiar with. And the reason for that is because most Jews in the world, and most Jews in the United States, come from Europe. They come from the Ashkenazi tradition, and their singing sounds more European. So here we have a song that sounds more Middle Eastern, and I will let him know that you said it sounds like the opera. That's beautiful. Okay, so that's the presentation for this part of this. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I'm interested in like the women's role. Is it like pretty egalitarian? Is it more?
Okay. So the question is about the women's role. So the one thing the Karaites were known for from the beginning is actually having a more egalitarian approach to women. And I'll give you an example. In the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, in old Spain, the Karaites had a large community. And that community had a leader in the 11th century. Her name is Al-Mu'allima. It's Arabic for the teacher. And it was a female who was leading the community about 1,000 years ago. So even back then, there was no prohibition between having female leaders of the community. Another thing that makes the Karaite tradition a little bit more, as you would say, egalitarian, is that a woman can sign her ketubah in the Karaite tradition. In the Orthodox Rabbinite tradition, a woman does not sign her ketubah. Another example is in the Karaite tradition, you need 10 witnesses for a wedding, or for religious ceremonies, but for a wedding in particular. And so the ketubah has 10 places for signatures, and women can count as witnesses for signatures. Now, this might be a little bit too detailed for you, but also in the really Orthodox Rabbinic tradition, they have something that generally prohibits I'm going to simplify this, but it prohibits hearing a woman sing in certain situations. The Karaites don't have that prohibition. And we'll talk about the Karaite prayer in a second, and we will we'll talk about the Karaite prayer in a second, and we will show you how it works. But a woman can actually sing various parts of the Karaite prayer. So for the most part, it's more egalitarian, but I want to emphasize that the Karaites don't look at it as egalitarian. We just look at it as this is what the law is intended. Yeah, there's a question? Any other questions? Yeah.
So you have all these benches set up, but you say that you're granting ground.
Okay.
So do you use the benches?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll talk to you about the synagogue in a second, but yes, we do use the benches for a few reasons. Sometimes we have visitors from the rabbinic community who aren't comfortable fully prostrating. And sometimes we have members from our own community who are getting old and their knees aren't great and their hips aren't great. So they sit on the benches for that also. Yes?
So, are there rabbis? Do they go, they educate as?
Yeah, so great question. So are there rabbis? So the Karaite tradition community definitely has religious leaders, and there's programs where they can become, I'll use the term very loosely, ordained. And in Israel, they just graduated 12 people from this program, 5 of whom are going to actually have a formal ordained title. I should tell you, in Israel, there are 12 Karaite synagogues, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier. This is actually the only freestanding Karaite Jewish synagogue in the United States. There's none in Canada either. There's none in South America. So as a freestanding Karaite synagogue, this is the only one in the United States. There are people who pray in homes, but this is it as far as Karaite synagogues. And I'll talk to you more about that there. But yeah, so the Karaite tradition has communal leaders. We have what's called a council of sages in Israel, and they help set certain policies and help coordinate with Israel. But what's interesting about it is I'm allowed as a Karaite to disagree with their interpretations, right? I mentioned earlier that in the Karaite tradition, everybody has the right to and the responsibility to interpret the Torah. So the chief Karaite rabbi, or the chief chacham of the council of sages, was here. And I told him, I disagree with one of the fundamental positions that you have. And he asked me some questions to test me and make sure I really thought about it. He's like, okay, look, you've thought about it. I cannot say as a Karaite that you're wrong, but I have a different opinion. So, anybody else? Great. So that's it for here. Thank you guys very much. In a few moments, we're actually going to enter the sanctuary, and I will show you what's going to happen there. But don't enter just yet because there's a few requirements that we have to go over, okay?